Saturday, October 12th, 2019, Monaco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. We had a very interesting end to the week, the last couple of days. All to do with trade, right? All to do with Brexit and maybe getting a deal for Brexit. We got a phase one trade deal, which is really ridiculous. It's all spin, right? And the markets reacted violently. The pound rebounded from a couple of days ago from 122 to 126 against the dollar. We saw the Dow up as much as 500 yesterday. But in all those two distractions, one thing that still is in my mind is the debt. And this is what worries me. This here, the US debt clock. You look at it, we're approaching 23 trillion. The debt to GDP ratio is at 106% almost. And below, towards the bottom right, you've got the unfunded liabilities. Last time I reported on those, maybe about a month ago, it was at 125 trillion. Now it's above 126 trillion. So yeah, that's the US debt clock. Very worrying. I recommend you go and look at that. You can go forward and see how really bad it's going to get. 2023. So let's see where we're going to be in 2023. If things keep going as they are, if there are no recessions, right? If everything is as forecast, right? There's no crisis here. Well, US debt to GDP will be at 121% almost. And then you look also at the UK, because you can get other countries as well. UK debt to GDP, almost at 100% there, as you can see, 99.2. Germany, just above it. People keep saying that Germany is not doing well as an economy, and maybe not. But they have a fairly tidy fiscal policy, right? I guess... not according to Paul Krugman, of course, who said that Germany is running a ruinous fiscal policy because they're running a surplus, right? You see, their debt to GDP is 58.9%. So that's what we need to keep in the back of our minds. These are all distractions out there. These trade negotiations or trade wars, whatever you want to call it, Brexit, all distractions. If you look at the British pound, for example, going back to 2007 when it topped at 211 against the dollar. Even before Brexit, the referendum, were down already to 150. So it doesn't really matter if there's a deal or no deal. Going forward, the only way for the UK to carry this burden of debt is through debasement of the currency, i.e. printing more money, creating more credit. Same thing for the US and a lot of other countries, right? So that's what we have to worry about. So yeah, there were a lot of distractions out there, but the debt is the problem. The other thing, the major thing I really want to talk today though, is the big news for this week, which you probably won't hear about. Let's say in the mainstream media and maybe even in some alternative channels, YouTube channels like mine or blogs or whatever. It's that the major too big to fail banks in the world have been bailed out this past week. Yes, they were bailed out. There's nothing in the news about it, right? Except one little hint on Thursday, which I talked about actually, which was that the BIS and the Fed had dropped liquidity rules for the international banks in the US, and that helped Deutsche Bank the most, right? I saw that Zero Hedge caught on to that, but yesterday. So I'm not bragging, but I was ahead of a Zero Hedge. And the other thing as well, of course, the major tool they've used to bail out the major international banks, including the US banks, because these too big to fail banks are not just US, as you can see here. This is a list from the BIS's FSB, right? And you can see JP Morgan, Citigroup, Deutsche Bank, HSBC, Bank of America, even Bank of China. There's banks from all over the world. The BIS calls them GSIB, which means globally systemically important banks. They're banks that they're very scared to let go, or else it could bring the whole house of cards down. Is it really a great system that we have to keep an eye on these? So what was the tool then that they used to bail these banks out? Well, it was the announcement yesterday, which was kind of lost in all the attention on the trade deal, Brexit, and everything else, right? So as Zero Hedge reports, QE4, not a QE, begins. Fed starts buying 60 billion in bills per month beginning next week. And looks like they're going to be doing this for another 6 months, maybe into the middle of next year. And you would have thought, oh, so they're going to stop helping the repo, right? Oh, no, they're not going to do that. As Zero Hedge says here, they're going to keep doing it. So they say, sure, Jerome, whatever you say, a 60 billion in POMO, which is treasury bills, right? They're going to be doing it in treasury bills. 75 billion in weekly overnight repos, 70 billion in term repo. So you add that up, it's quite a bit, isn't it? It's 205 billion they're going to be doing. And the repo, they're going to keep doing it until probably the end of January. So a little problem that started in September, a little problem that was supposed to be solved by the end of September, right? We were told that it was because of banks or corporations having to pay their tax bills end of the quarter, right? But it doesn't go away. So that tells me that the banks are in trouble. They've had to drop liquidity rules for the banks. And aside from doing helping these repo, they're going to be adding even more through these POMOs. They're not calling it QE. And I actually think what they're doing as well, the Federal Reserve, because the curve has been inverted from 3s to 10 years, 3 months to 10 year, since late last year, I think. I'm not sure exactly, but for a long time. And that usually, how can I say, forecasts or points towards a recession. And why is that? Well, because banks' revenues and margins lower because they make less money borrowing in the short term and lending in the long term. And I actually think what they're doing by buying T-bills is trying to steepen the curve so that the banks can start making bigger margins to bail them out, right? But one thing is that, yeah, they can try to do that, but as Zero Hedge said as well in a great article here, Treasury yield curve uninverts, seals fate of imminent recession. So this article talks about how in the past 2 recessions in 01, 08, and 09, every time after the curve inverts, when it starts steepening, that's when the recession starts. And they've got the charts to show here. I'll put a link below to this article in the description. So yes, in my opinion, that was the biggest news this week. I guess it wasn't put out like that. Federal Reserve bails out the major too big to fail banks, right? But that's what they're doing. They need to keep these banks going. Why is that? Well, because Uncle Sam and John Bull here in the UK and everywhere else running major deficits, major debt. So are the Chinese. I mean, the budget deficit in China is like 4%. In the US is 5.5% if you take the latest data. In the UK is not as high. So if the major Wall Street banks, the too big to fail, collapse, the whole house of cards collapses. Governments can't fund themselves. It's all part of the game. So that was the biggest news. I think the news on the trade deal are a joke. And I'm not pro-Trump or anti-Trump or anything. I'm just looking at the facts. I think the Brexit thing is a joke as well. I recommend you listen to a video I'm putting up in the cards. Tory Brexit poll lead could melt away. It's by Jeff Taylor. He explains what he thinks is going on with this Northern Ireland and the fact that they might have a deal. He thinks that Boris Johnson could be surrendering Northern Ireland to the EU, that the Northern Ireland is going to stay in the customs union with the EU, but I don't see how that could work. And the major party from Northern Ireland, which has been in a coalition with the Tories for the last few years, are totally against that. So things are not out of the woods either for Brexit or the trade. So what about the trade? This is what the FT says about the trade deal, and I'll read a little bit through this article. U.S. agrees limited trade deal with China. Substantial phase one agreement offers some U.S. tariff relief for limited Chinese concessions. The other thing that I would note, if this was a really important negotiation over the last few days, why would they send the vice premier? Why wouldn't Xi Jinping come and see Trump if it was that important, right? I would say that first. The other thing I would say, we were supposed to have had the trade deal done by March 1st this year, right? Just keep that in mind. I always keep reminding people about that, right? So let's have a look here at what the FT says. U.S. and China reached a truce in their trade war on Friday after Washington agreed a limited deal that will see the U.S. hold off on tariff increases next week. So they're not holding off on tariffs, just the increases, in exchange for some Chinese concessions, primarily on agricultural purchases. The tentative agreement, described by Donald Trump, the U.S. president, as a substantial phase one deal. So how many phases are you going to have? 25 phases? 2 phases? This is the first time I've heard of phase one. Will offer some respite to the global economy and could calm markets unnerved by escalating tensions between the countries. I don't think, as I've said before, the world economy and the markets are going down no matter what. It's more to do with the credit cycle and the fact that things go in cycles. Like, I don't stay up 24/7 or else I would die eventually. People need to rest, and so do credit markets, right? It's not because of the trade dispute. It might help trigger it, but it's not because of it. However, it would fall short of the sweeping reset in U.S.-China economic relations that Mr. Trump has sought from his early days in the White House and on the 2016 presidential campaign trail. U.S. and Chinese officials are expected to finalize the text of the limited agreement in the next 5 weeks. There you go, ahead of a possible summit between Mr. Trump and Xi Jinping, China's president, at the APEC leaders meeting in Chile next month. APEC is an association of Pacific Economic Community, most countries that are within the Pacific region. If the deal is completed, it would give Mr. Trump a chance to claim progress on trade as he faces rising political pressure. So anyway, there you go. That's what's going on. Nothing really has been, it's just been kicked down the road for another 5 weeks. So they didn't really get an agreement. They're still ironing out for the next 5 weeks. So there you go. A lot of noise towards the end of the week. As it pertains to the trade negotiations, as it pertains to Brexit. But in my opinion, the biggest news this week, and there's no spotlight on it. All the spotlight was on trade, Brexit, right? And that's what they want. Biggest news is the bailout of the major banks by the Federal Reserve, by the BIS. Yes, that's the major news. And we're in a crisis, but they don't want to call it a crisis. It's just like it's all spin, right? They don't want to call it QE as well, because if they call it QE, they'd have to admit it's a crisis. But it is QE, and it's going to get worse. So what do you do in this situation? As I've said before, try to be outside the system as much as possible. Some people ask me, well, what if there is hyperinflation? Won't that write off the debt? It might, but on the other side of the hyperinflation, you can bet the bankers will reinstate that debt at the previous value before the hyperinflation. In my opinion, the best thing is to try to deal as little as possible with the bankers. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. Make sure you share this video far and wide. And you can also follow me on Twitter, Steemit, and on DTube. I wish you all a great weekend. Take care. Bye.